The Texas State Capitol hearing room was filled to capacity for what had been expected to be a routine session of the House Committee on State Affairs. Every leather chair in the ornate chamber was occupied, with additional spectators standing along the marble walls, their presence reflecting the growing public interest in the committee's investigation into state contracting procedures. The room's grand architecture, its carved wooden panels, brass fixtures and imposing portraits of Texas historical figures provided a dignified backdrop for what was about to become one of the most explosive legislative hearings in recent state history. At the elevated committee dais, the 13 members sat behind their microphones and nameplates, with Chairman Robert Martinez, a moderate Republican from San Antonio, in the center position. To his right and left sat the committee members, 7 Republicans and 5 Democrats, whose questioning would drive the day's proceedings. The witness table faced them directly, positioned so that anyone testifying would address both the committee and the gallery behind them. Today's hearing was the third in a series examining the state's procurement process for major contracts following concerns about transparency and potential conflicts of interest. The scheduled witnesses included several procurement officials and ethics experts, but it was the unexpected addition of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to the witness list that had drawn such unusual attendance. Crockett, though serving in Congress, had requested to appear based on findings from her office's examination of federal infrastructure funds flowing to state-managed contracts. Initially, her appearance had been viewed as a routine information sharing between federal and state officials, which explained why Governor Greg Abbott's administration hadn't expressed concerns about her testimony. The governor's office had sent a mid-level representative, Ryan Stevens, Deputy Director of Budget and Procurement, rather than anyone from Abbott's inner circle, suggesting they anticipated no significant revelations. Stevens sat confidently in the gallery, occasionally checking his phone as the initial witnesses delivered technical testimony about procurement regulations and procedures. When Crockett's turn came, she approached the witness table with measured steps. At 42, the former civil rights attorney carried herself with the focused energy that had become her trademark in both courtrooms and congressional hearings. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, she placed a slim portfolio on the table before her, arranged her materials methodically, and adjusted the microphone. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You're about to witness one of the most extraordinary moments in Texas political history, when methodical investigation and precise documentation transform a routine hearing into a revelation that sends shockwaves through an entire state. Thank you, Chairman Martinez and committee members, for allowing me to share information relevant to your investigation of state contracting procedures, Crockett began, her voice clear and measured. While my congressional role focuses primarily on federal matters, my office has identified concerning patterns in how certain federal infrastructure funds are being allocated through state contracting processes that fall directly within the scope of this committee's inquiry. She opened her portfolio and removed several documents. With the committee's permission, I'd like to present specific findings regarding the relationship between state contract awards and certain financial interests that have not been properly disclosed to the public or to regulatory bodies. Chairman Martinez nodded. Please proceed, Congresswoman. Crockett placed her first document on the overhead projector. This is a compilation of state highway construction contracts awarded over the past 18 months, specifically for projects funded primarily through the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The screen displayed a spreadsheet showing contract amounts, companies, and project descriptions. As you'll notice, approximately 62% of these federally funded contracts, totaling just over $3.8 billion, were awarded to subsidiaries of 3 corporate entities, despite 17 qualified bidders participating in the process. Stevens, the governor's procurement representative, sat up slightly straighter in the gallery, his attention now fully on Crockett's presentation rather than his phone. When my office examined the ownership structures of these three seemingly separate corporate entities, Crockett continued, we discovered that all three share a common majority investor, a private equity firm called Meridian Partners based in Austin. She displayed a second document showing corporate registration filings and ownership diagrams. Meridian's ownership structure is complex, utilizing multiple shell companies and offshore entities that effectively obscure who ultimately benefits from these billions in public contracts. The committee members leaned forward, their interest visibly increasing as Crockett continued her methodical presentation. Through cooperation with federal regulatory agencies and foreign financial authorities, my office has tracked the beneficial ownership through these layers of companies. She placed a third document on the projector, a complex ownership diagram with highlighted pathways. The majority ownership of Meridian Partners, which controls the three construction companies receiving these contracts, traces back to a private investment vehicle called Lone Star Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. Stevens was now frantically typing on his phone, apparently alerting colleagues to the unexpected direction of Crockett's testimony. The critical question, Crockett continued, her tone remaining measured and professional, is who owns and benefits from Lone Star Holdings, which ultimately received approximately $820 million in profit from these publicly funded contracts over the past 18 months. She removed another document from her portfolio, this one a series of banking records and transfer documents. Through financial disclosures required in other jurisdictions and cross-border transaction records obtained through official channels, we've determined that Lone Star Holdings is primarily owned by a single individual, operating through multiple shell companies, specifically designed to prevent public identification. The room had grown completely silent as Crockett reached the critical revelation. That individual is James Wellington, who simultaneously serves as the chairman of Texans for Responsible Government, the single largest donor to Governor Abbott's Political Action Committee, having contributed $28.7 million over the past 4 election cycles. She displayed banking records showing transfers from Lone Star Holdings to Wellington's personal accounts, alongside political contribution records documenting his donations to Abbott's PAC. To be absolutely clear about the implications, Crockett stated, her voice still calm but carrying unmistakable gravity, the evidence shows that the individual serving as Governor Abbott's largest political donor has received over $800 million in profits from state contracts awarded during the governor's administration. Contracts that were steered to companies he secretly controls through an elaborate network of shell companies and offshore entities specifically designed to hide his financial interest. For several seconds, the hearing room remained in stunned silence as the full implications of Crockett's revelation registered with the committee and audience. Stevens, the governor's representative, was now on his feet and moving quickly toward the exit, phone pressed to his ear. Chairman Martinez, visibly processing the magnitude of what had just been presented, finally broke the silence. Congresswoman Crockett, these are extraordinarily serious allegations. Can you clarify how you obtained these financial records and verify their authenticity? Certainly, Chairman, Crockett replied. Each document in this presentation was obtained through official channels, either public records, regulatory filings required in various jurisdictions, or information sharing between congressional oversight committees and regulatory agencies with proper legal authority. The authentication information is included in the complete dossier I've prepared for the committee, including document identifiers, certification stamps, and chain of custody verification. She added, I want to emphasize that I'm not presenting unofficial materials or unverified allegations. These are authenticated financial and corporate records that have been verified through multiple independent sources and jurisdictions. The methodical, documented nature of Crockett's presentation made it nearly impossible to dismiss as political theatre. She wasn't making accusations based on anonymous sources or circumstantial evidence. She was presenting specific financial records, corporate filings, and regulatory documents that created an irrefutable paper trail from state contracts to the governor's largest donor. A Democratic committee member, Representative Garcia, was the first to follow up. Congresswoman, to be absolutely clear, are you saying that Governor Abbott's administration awarded billions in state contracts to companies secretly owned by his largest campaign donor, and that this ownership was deliberately concealed through shell companies and offshore entities? The documents speak for themselves, Crockett responded, maintaining her professional tone. The financial records clearly show that James Wellington is both the primary beneficial owner of the companies receiving these contracts and the governor's largest political donor. The elaborate corporate structures appear specifically designed to prevent public awareness of this connection. A Republican committee member, Representative Thompson, who had previously been a reliable Abbott ally, now asked a question that demonstrated the bipartisan impact of the revelation. Has Mr. Wellington disclosed his ownership interest in these companies on any state ethics filings or contract disclosure forms? No, Representative Thompson, Crockett replied, displaying another document. This is a compilation of all disclosure forms filed in connection with these contracts. In each case, the ownership was attributed only to the immediate corporate entities, not to the ultimate beneficial owner. The offshore structure appears specifically designed to avoid triggering disclosure requirements. As the questioning continued, the hearing room began filling with additional staff members, journalists, and observers as word of Crockett's revelation spread throughout the Capitol. Phones lit up across the room as people messaged colleagues and news organizations about what was unfolding. Chairman Martinez, recognizing the significance of the moment, maintained rigorous order while ensuring Crockett had the opportunity to fully present her evidence. Congresswoman, given the serious nature of these findings, what specific concerns do you believe this committee should address? 3 primary concerns, Crockett responded without hesitation. First, the apparent deliberate circumvention of state ethics and disclosure requirements through complex corporate structures. Second, the statistical improbability that companies sharing a common undisclosed owner would legitimately win 62% of these contracts without some form of improper influence. And third, the fundamental conflict of interest when an elected official's largest political donor secretly profits from government contracts awarded under that official's administration. For the next hour, committee members from both parties asked increasingly detailed questions about the documentation Crockett had presented. Throughout, she maintained her focus on the specific evidence rather than making broader political accusations, responding to each question with precise references to particular documents and their authentication. This approach made it extraordinarily difficult for the revelation to be dismissed along partisan lines. She wasn't attacking Abbott personally or making sweeping claims about corruption. She was simply presenting meticulously documented financial connections that raised serious ethical and legal questions about the state's contracting process. As the hearing continued, the governor's office issued a hasty statement. The administration is not familiar with the details of individual contract awards, which are handled through established procurement procedures by career staff. Governor Abbott has no involvement in contract decisions and no knowledge of the corporate structures described in today's hearing. This attempt at distance only heightened interest in the connections Crockett had documented. By mid-afternoon, every major news organization in Texas was leading with the story, many already conducting their own verification of the public records components of Crockett's presentation. The political earthquake expanded when 3 Republican committee members joined their Democratic colleagues in calling for a formal investigation, Chairman Martinez, after consulting briefly with committee counsel, announced the formation of a special investigative subcommittee with subpoena power to further examine the contract's corporate structures and potential violations of state ethics laws. The evidence presented today raises questions that transcend partisan considerations, Martinez stated. The integrity of our state's contracting process and the proper use of public funds demand thorough investigation regardless of political affiliations. Outside the hearing room, reporters surrounded Crockett, seeking additional comments on her findings. Maintaining her measured approach, she focused on the documentation rather than political implications. Today's presentation wasn't about politics, but about transparency and proper use of public resources, she told journalists. The documents speak for themselves. They show financial connections that should have been disclosed, but were deliberately concealed through complex corporate structures. Texans deserve to know who profits from their tax dollars, regardless of political affiliation. When asked if she was alleging criminal conduct by the governor, Crockett's response was characteristically precise. I've presented financial and corporate records that document specific relationships. Whether those relationships violate state ethics laws, contract regulations, or criminal statutes is for appropriate authorities to determine based on thorough investigation. This careful framing, focusing on documented facts rather than accusations, made her presentation all the more powerful. By evening, legal experts across the political spectrum were appearing on news programs to discuss the potential violations documented in Crockett's presentation. The deliberate concealment of beneficial ownership through offshore structures, specifically to avoid disclosure requirements, could potentially violate multiple state ethics laws, noted a former Republican state attorney general on a local news broadcast. The question isn't whether these financial relationships exist. The documentation appears quite solid on that front. The question is whether they were legally required to be disclosed and whether the contract award process was improperly influenced. For Abbott's administration, the damage control efforts faced a fundamental challenge. Crockett had presented specific, documented financial connections rather than vague allegations. Attempts to dismiss her presentation as politically motivated gained little traction precisely because she had maintained such a professional, evidence-based approach focused on the documents rather than political accusations. The governor's team faces a substantive rather than political challenge, observed a crisis communications expert interviewed by the Dallas Morning News. When specific financial records show your largest donor secretly profiting from government contracts, standard political deflection strategies don't work. You need to address the specific documented relationships, not just the messenger presenting them. By the following morning, the earthquake had grown larger as additional dimensions of the story emerged. The Securities and Exchange Commission announced it was examining potential securities violations related to the undisclosed beneficial ownership of publicly traded subsidiaries involved in the contracts. The Texas Ethics Commission called an emergency meeting to review possible violations of state disclosure requirements. Most significantly, 3 Republican state senators who had previously been reliable Abbott supporters issued a joint statement calling for complete transparency regarding the contract award process and any relationships between political donors and state contracts. Their statement explicitly referenced the disturbing documentation presented by Congresswoman Crockett and called for answers that satisfied Texans' right to know how their tax dollars are being spent, regardless of partisan considerations. The political impact transcended typical partisan divisions because Crockett had focused so precisely on documented financial relationships rather than broader political accusations. Citizens across the political spectrum found themselves troubled by the specific pattern she had revealed. "I've supported Governor Abbott in every election," said a small business owner interviewed in Lubbock. But if his biggest donor is secretly getting billions in state contracts through hidden companies, that's not conservative governance. That's the kind of insider dealing we're supposed to be fighting against. A week after the hearing, with investigations now proceeding on multiple fronts, James Wellington, the donor at the center of the revelation, finally issued a statement through his attorneys. Rather than denying the financial relationships Crockett had documented, the statement focused on technicalities. Mr. Wellington's investment activities comply with all applicable laws. The corporate structures referenced in recent reporting reflect standard business practices for complex international investments. Mr. Wellington has no involvement in the contract bidding process and has never discussed specific contracts with any state officials. This carefully worded statement's failure to deny the fundamental relationships Crockett had documented only intensified public interest in the story. Within days, a poll showed that 72% of Texans, including 64% of self-identified Republicans, supported a full investigation into the contract awards and the financial relationships between Wellington's companies and the state. For Crockett, the aftermath brought increased national attention, but no change in her methodical approach. In her first extended interview after the hearing, she maintained her focus on the documented facts rather than political advantage. "This isn't about partisan politics," she explained on a Sunday news program. "It's about whether public contracts are being awarded based on merit and best value, or whether other factors are influencing these decisions. It's about whether disclosure requirements are being deliberately circumvented through complex corporate structures. Those questions matter to all Texans regardless of political affiliation." When asked how she had uncovered these connections when state oversight bodies had missed them, Crockett credited collaborative investigation rather than individual effort. "This was the result of methodical research across jurisdictions," she explained. "My office worked with regulatory bodies in multiple countries, following the money through various corporate structures. The critical breakthrough came from cross-referencing international banking records with domestic political contributions, connections that don't become visible unless you're specifically looking across those different systems." Political scientists noted the effectiveness of Crockett's approach as a model of substantive oversight. What made her presentation so powerful wasn't rhetorical skill, but substantive preparation, explained a professor from Rice University. By presenting authenticated documents that revealed specific financial relationships, she made it nearly impossible for the administration to dismiss her findings as partisan attacks. The evidence spoke for itself. 3 months after the initial hearing, the Special Investigative Committee issued its preliminary report, which confirmed the essential financial relationships Crockett had documented while identifying multiple apparent violations of state ethics and disclosure requirements. The report, supported unanimously by the committee's members from both parties, recommended comprehensive reforms to contract disclosure requirements and referred several potential violations for further investigation by the appropriate authorities. 6 months later, the Texas legislature, with bipartisan support, passed the Government Contract Transparency Act, establishing new requirements for disclosure of beneficial ownership, prohibiting significant political donors from receiving state contracts, and creating enhanced enforcement mechanisms for ethics regulations. The legislation passed with veto-proof majorities in both chambers, reflecting how thoroughly the revelation had transcended partisan divisions. For political observers, the entire episode offered a case study in effective accountability that cut through partisan defenses. It demonstrated that when oversight focuses on meticulously documented facts rather than political narratives, it can create accountability that resonates across political divisions. Crockett's approach worked because it wasn't framed as a partisan attack on Abbott, noted a government ethics expert. It was framed as a specific documented set of financial relationships that raised serious questions about the integrity of the state's contracting process. That approach made it much harder to dismiss through standard political deflection techniques. A year after the hearing, when Texas Monthly published a comprehensive analysis of the reforms implemented following Crockett's revelation, they concluded, "The contract transparency reforms represent a rare example of substantive political change, driven not by scandal or partisan advantage, but by the simple introduction of documented facts into a political system that had failed to uncover them through normal channels." The article continued, "What began with Congresswoman Crockett's methodical presentation of financial records has culminated in a contracting system with significantly improved transparency, stronger ethical safeguards, and bipartisan support for maintaining these reforms, changes that benefit Texans regardless of their political perspective." For those who had witnessed or later studied the hearing, it represented a powerful reminder that in a functioning democracy, accountability ultimately depends not on partisan advantage, but on the introduction of documented facts into public discourse, particularly when those facts reveal relationships between money, influence, and governance that affect citizens across political divides. The Wellington contracts revelation wasn't fundamentally about Republican versus Democrat, observed a political analyst. It was about whether government contracts should go to companies secretly owned by an elected official's largest donor. That's a question that troubles citizens across the political spectrum when presented with specific, documented evidence rather than partisan accusations. For Crockett herself, the experience reinforced her commitment to substance over spectacle. Effective oversight isn't about scoring political points, she told a graduating class of public policy students. It's about doing the meticulous work of following money, documenting relationships, and presenting facts in a way that allows citizens to draw their own conclusions about whether their government is truly serving the public interest. She concluded with a reflection that transcended the specific revelation. When we focus on documented facts rather than partisan narratives, we create the possibility for accountability that serves all citizens, not just those who share our political perspective. That's how democracy is supposed to work. The legacy of Crockett's revelation ultimately wasn't about damage to one administration or advantage to one party. It was about raising the standard for transparency in government contracting across the political spectrum, ensuring that future administrations of any party would face stronger disclosure requirements and greater public scrutiny of the relationship between political donations and government contracts. If you found this breakdown of how methodical research and documented evidence can transform political accountability valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on more moments where substantive oversight cuts through partisan divisions. What other government functions do you think would benefit from this kind of meticulous, document-based examination? Share your thoughts in the comments below.